This is the story of a weapon so devastating that when Allied intelligence first heard about it, they dismissed it as Nazi propaganda. A weapon that turned the night sky over Germany into a killing field where bombers would simply explode without warning, leaving survivors to wonder what invisible force had struck them. On the night of December 22, 1943, Major Wilhelm Herget climbed into his Junkers Ju-88 night fighter armed with something that would make him one of the deadliest pilots in history. In just 9 minutes, he destroyed 6 RAF bombers. That's one massive 4-engine bomber every 90 seconds. But here's the thing, he didn't attack them from the side. He didn't dive on them from above. He attacked them from directly below, using cannons that fired straight up. And just like jazz was considered inappropriate in Nazi Germany, this weapon system was so unconventional that even many Luftwaffe pilots initially mocked it, until they saw what it could do. The conventional wisdom of air combat in World War II was simple. You got on your enemy's tail, you lined up your gun sights, and you fired straight ahead. Maybe you'd attack from the side or dive from above, but you always fired in the direction you were flying. The idea of mounting cannons to fire upward at a 60 to 80-degree angle seemed absurd, impractical, a waste of weight and ammunition. But there was one massive blind spot in every Allied bomber's defenses, directly below. The Lancaster, the Halifax, the Sterling, these giants of the night had gun turrets covering almost every angle except straight down. Their crews couldn't see what was beneath them, and even if they could, they had no way to shoot at it. The story begins in 1941, when Oberleutnant Rudolf Skonet started experimenting with upward-firing weapons. He wasn't the first to think of it. The concept had been tried in World War I, but he was the first to recognize how perfectly it could exploit the vulnerabilities of modern heavy bombers. These weren't the nimble fighters of daylight battles. These were massive, predictable targets flying in straight lines through the darkness. By 1942, prototype installations were being tested on various aircraft. The Germans tried different configurations, some with single cannons, some with pairs. They experimented with different angles, 70 degrees, 80 degrees, what would give the best field of fire while still allowing the pilot to aim effectively. The early tests showed promise, but it wasn't until May 1943 that the first operational Schräge Musik sorties took place. And that's when everything changed. Picture this. You're flying at night, beneath a stream of bombers heading for German cities. Your radar operator guides you into position. You throttle back, matching the bomber's speed. You slide directly underneath, so close you can see every rivet, every panel line in the moonlight. The bomber crew above has no idea you're there. Their gunners are scanning the horizon, looking for fighters attacking from conventional angles. You line up your gun sight, not on the bomber itself, but on a point in space where you calculate the bomber will be when your shells arrive. You're aiming for the fuel tanks between the engines. One squeeze of the trigger, 20 to 30 rounds burst upward. The shells punch through the bomber's thin belly armor and into the fuel tanks. The effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. The bomber doesn't just catch fire, it explodes. To other bombers in the formation, it looks like their companion has spontaneously detonated. No tracers coming from the side, no fighter diving from above. Just sudden, inexplicable destruction. This is what made Schräge Musik so psychologically devastating. Survivors returned to base with wild stories of bombers exploding for no apparent reason. Some thought they'd hit German flak traps. Others believed the Germans had some kind of aerial mine. The truth, that fighters were lurking beneath them like sharks, was almost too simple to believe. Which brings us back to Wilhelm Herget and that December night in 1943. Herget wasn't just any pilot. By this point in the war, he was already an ace with dozens of victories. But even for him, what happened that night was extraordinary. The RAF had launched another massive raid, hundreds of bombers streaming toward German targets. Herget and his radar operator Paul Marl took off into the darkness. Their Ju-88 G6 was equipped with the latest radar and, crucially, a pair of 20mm cannons in the Schräge Musik configuration. At approximately 2200 hours, they made contact with the bomber stream. What followed was 9 minutes of systematic destruction. Herget slipped beneath bomber after bomber, firing short, precise bursts. 6 times he fired. 6 times a bomber died. Think about the skill this required. He wasn't just pointing and shooting. He was flying in complete darkness, maintaining precise position beneath targets moving at over 200 miles per hour, calculating deflection angles in 3 dimensions, all while avoiding the debris of exploding aircraft above him. One mistake, flying too close to an exploding bomber, and he'd be killed by his own success. But Herget made no mistakes that night. When he finally turned for home, low on ammunition, he left behind a trail of burning wreckage. 6 crews, 36 to 42 men gone in less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The impact of Schräge Musik went far beyond individual pilots like Herget. Night fighter units equipped with the system reported kill rates 3 times higher than those using conventional tactics. By late 1943, widespread deployment had begun, and suddenly the night bombing campaign that RAF Bomber Command had counted on to cripple German industry was in jeopardy. The British response to the invisible killer was confusion and denial. When intelligence reports first mentioned upward-firing cannons, they were dismissed. It had to be propaganda, a cover story for some other German secret weapon. Even when prisoners of war described the system, Allied intelligence remained skeptical. The idea was just too foreign to accepted air combat doctrine. This disbelief persisted well into 1944. Bomber crews continued to report mysterious losses. Aircraft would simply explode without warning. Survivors who bailated out reported seeing no attacking fighters. The Germans, recognizing the psychological value of this mystery, maintained strict operational security around Schräge Musik. Even within the Luftwaffe, many pilots didn't know about it initially. When the British finally accepted the reality of Schräge Musik, they had to completely revise their tactics. Bomber formations became looser. They added downward-looking observation windows. They changed their routing and timing. But by then, hundreds of bombers had already fallen to the jazz music cannons. The system wasn't without controversy, even among the Germans. Some old-school fighter pilots considered it unsporting, too easy, lacking in honor. They preferred the traditional dogfight, plane against plane, skill against skill. Shooting at an unsuspecting target from below wasn't real combat in their minds. Others argued about technical details. What was the optimal angle? 70 degrees gave you a better field of fire, but made aiming more difficult. 80 degrees made it easier to stay in the bomber's blind spot, but limited your targeting options. Different units developed their own preferences. There was also the question of which cannons to use. The 20mm MG FFM and MG 150-120 had good ballistics and rate of fire. The 30mm Mk 108 hit much harder but had a lower muzzle velocity, making deflection shooting even more challenging. Each had its advocates, but for pilots like Herget, these debates were academic. What mattered was that Schräge Musik worked. It turned their night fighters into incredibly efficient killing machines. A single fighter could destroy multiple bombers in one sortie, something almost impossible with conventional tactics. The psychological impact on Allied aircrew was profound. Imagine flying through the night, watching the bomber next to you suddenly explode, then another, with no visible cause. The darkness once protected them now hid an invisible predator. Every moment became a test of nerve. Were they flying over flak concentration? Had they stumbled into a new German weapon, or was there a night fighter stalking them from below? Some RAF crews never knew Schräge Musik existed. They completed their tour, went home, and lived the rest of their lives thinking they'd survived some mysterious German secret weapon. It wasn't until after the war, when intelligence files were opened and German pilots told their stories, that the full truth emerged. The effectiveness of Schräge Musik peaked in early 1944. German night fighters were downing bombers at unprecedented rates, but as with many German innovations late in the war, success came too late. By March 1945, fuel shortages meant fewer night fighter sorties. The bomber streams kept coming, now with long-range escort fighters and improved defensive tactics. When the war ended in May 1945, Schräge Musik died with it. The system that had terrorized bomber crews for 2 years vanished almost overnight. In the jet age that followed, with radar-guided missiles and supersonic speeds, the idea of sneaking up beneath an enemy aircraft became obsolete. Or did it actually disappear? The Japanese had independently developed similar upward-firing guns, their Type 2 system, showing that the concept had universal application. And in today's world of drone warfare and asymmetric conflicts, the principle of attacking from unexpected angles remains as relevant as ever. Wilhelm Herget survived the war. The man who had destroyed 6 bombers in 9 minutes lived until 1974, carrying with him the memories of those deadly nights over Germany. His story, and the story of Schräge Musik, reminds us that in warfare, the most devastating weapons are often not the most powerful, but the most unexpected. Today, aviation museums around the world display night fighters with those distinctive upward-pointing cannon barrels. Flight simulation communities recreate the tactics, trying to understand the skill required to use them effectively. Historians pore over newly declassified documents, still uncovering details about this remarkable weapon system. The numbers tell only part of the story. Estimates suggest Schräge Musik-equipped fighters destroyed between 500 and 1,000 Allied bombers. Each of those bombers carried 7 to 10 men. Do the math, and you're looking at potentially thousands of aircrew killed by a weapon they never saw coming. But the most remarkable aspect of Schräge Musik wasn't its destructive power, it was how it challenged conventional thinking. In a war dominated by tradition-bound military hierarchies, someone looked at the problem of attacking bombers and asked, why are we doing it this way? Why not from below? Why not exploit their blind spot? That willingness to think differently, to challenge accepted wisdom, to mock conventional solutions, that's what made Schräge Musik so effective. It wasn't just about mounting guns at an odd angle. It was about seeing the battlefield from a new perspective. The pilots who first mocked the one-shot cannon learned a harsh lesson. In warfare, as in life, the most dangerous threats often come from the directions we're not watching. The RAF bomber crews over Germany certainly learned that lesson, though for many, it was the last thing they ever learned. So the next time someone proposes an unconventional solution, remember the story of Schräge Musik. Remember how the mocked became the feared, how the ridiculous became the lethal, and how 6 bombers died in 9 minutes because one pilot was willing to attack from an angle nobody expected. The jazz music has long since faded, but its lesson remains. In combat, in business, in life, sometimes the best approach is the one nobody sees coming, even if it means turning your guns toward the sky and waiting for your target to fly overhead.